Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man exploring the strange and forgotten corners of pop culture. This episode is another in our long-running series looking at the films of the Asylum, the mockbuster studio often regarded as the worst production company in the world. Today we're looking at Dracula, the original living vampire, a mockbuster designed to cash in on Sony's 2022 movie Morbius, a third-tier Marvel character who is known as the Living Vampire. Before we begin, I have the pleasant duty to thank a couple of new patrons. These are kind souls who've gone to www.patreon.com/HJDoom and pledged as little as a single English pound to support my nonsense. In this case, both patrons have been significantly more generous than that, and it is enormously appreciated. Chris and Daniel, thank you so much for your support. It's thanks to people like this that the podcast remains on the air and ad-free. All patrons get access to a bunch of gaming materials I've created, and I'm looking at making some of my weird fiction accessible to patrons as well. Now on with the show. We usually focus heavily on the mockbuster in these episodes, but this time it's going to be a little different because I actually watched Morbius as part of my preparation, and I'll be damned if I'm not going to talk about it. Although I watch a lot of terrible movies, I'm not actually that interested in big-budget bad movies. I'm always drawn to the stuff at the margins more than the stuff at the centre of pop culture, and I'm pretty good about shrugging my shoulders and walking away if I'm not having a nice time with modern blockbuster franchises. Making a bad movie for millions upon millions of dollars with access to the best talent in the world, it just irritates me on some fundamental level. Morbius is a little different because it's such an utterly misbegotten film based on a deeply stupid idea that only a media executive could have come up with. The circumstances that caused Morbius to be birthed into the world are fascinating, more interesting, arguably, than the end result. The film rights to Spider-Man are a complicated story in their own right, but essentially Columbia, a Sony subsidiary, was able to make a trilogy of very successful Spider-Man films in the early 2000s. They followed this with 2 further Spider-Man films and then licensed Spider-Man back to Disney to be part of the MCU. At the same time, they retained the rights to make films based on Spider-Man's supporting cast. When their standalone Venom movie did really pretty well for the studio, in a classic act of hubris, they assumed that they'd be able to create a new cinematic universe based on Spider-Man's supporting cast. Clearly, if people loved seeing one of Spider-Man's iconic villains on the big screen, they would also love seeing such beloved characters as Madam Web, Kraven the Hunter, and Morbius the Living Vampire. 3 films later, after flushing millions of dollars down the toilet, it transpired that actually just being connected to Spider-Man wasn't a guarantee of a film's success, in exactly the same way that the 1989 Batman movie didn't guarantee the success of other films based on pulp comic characters of the 30s and 40s like the Phantom and the Shadow. Perhaps if the movies had been better, things would have been different, but as it stands, Sony's efforts to create a new cinematic universe demonstrate that it is possible to screw up worse than the DCU. At least Universal saw the writing on the wall when their Mummy reboot failed entirely to launch a new cinematic universe. They didn't just carry on for 3 entire films. Now, there's a strong argument for saying that Morbius should have killed off future attempts to create a cinematic universe based on people Peter Parker has met. It's an ugly exercise in rampant cynicism, which at least has the decency to come in at about 90 minutes. I'm not going to get bogged down in the plot, but essentially Dr. Morbius, in trying to cure himself of a rare blood disease, turns himself into a kind of vampire, and that upsets him. His old friend, Evil O'Murder Bastard, has also the same blood disease and turns himself into a living vampire as well, and promptly carries on being Evil O'Murder Bastard, but with superpowers and a lust for blood. Can Dr. Morbius save the world from Evil O'Murder Bastard? Yes. Will he see any consequences whatsoever for that time he killed 8 people and drank their blood? Very much no. Will he at any point reflect on the fact that his entire research was bankrolled by Evil O'Murder Bastard and thus built on the back of crime? Also no. As a mass murderer whose scientific advances were built on the back of human misery, Morbius is a tough sell as a sympathetic protagonist. But fortunately, Sony cast Jared Leto in the lead at exactly the point that the world realised that Jared Leto was an extremely creepy ghoul of a man. So you have a terrible character being played by a terrible person who turned his desperately mediocre band into a kind of cult and has been accused of inappropriate behaviour by no less than 9 different women. It's like trying to do a superhero film where the lead character is Peter Sutcliffe and you've decided that he's going to be played by Prince Andrew. Early doors, Morbius refuses a Nobel Prize because he doesn't think that his research, which has saved many lives, is a success because he hasn't been able to cure his blood disease. He's basically saying that unless his research benefits him specifically, he's not actually interested. He's completely indifferent to the lives he's saved, just as later he'll be indifferent to the lives he takes. He's that much of a narcissist. To really hammer the point home, he doesn't quietly refuse the prize when he's nominated. He goes to the ceremony, wins the award, and then goes up on stage to refuse it in front of the entire world. It's not enough to say, thanks, but no thanks. He's got to make sure that the whole world knows that he's turning it down, and in such a way that no one else gets it. Because, of course, deep down he believes that he definitely deserves the Nobel Prize. He's possibly the least sympathetic lead character in a film since Oliver Stone's biopic of Nixon. Evil O Murder Bastard is played by Matt Smith, who is tremendous value, to be fair. His obvious joy in being an irredeemable shit stands in stark contrast to Morbius, who seems faintly bemused and irritated that the police would come after him after his botched experiment leaves 8 people dead and his love interest in a coma. His love interest, played with broad indifference by Adira Arjona, remains completely devoted to the man who nearly killed her throughout the film, providing the kind of unconditional emotional support that awful men always seem to think they are owed. This will become interesting when we talk about Dracula, the original living vampire, and how it presents Dracula relating to women. Of course, it's not just the characters that suck. It's shot with the care and attention of a mandatory training video about manual handling, and the special effects are risible. It's full of those ephemeral particle effects that modern movies seem to think look so impressive. It often looks like the vampires are melting as streamers of particles combine with the constant use of slow motion to make every action sequence look like someone put wax dummies in a very hot wind tunnel. It's the sort of film that only a business psychopath could love, a film in which consequences are for the little people, not gifted scientists with superpowers who killed 8 people and put a woman in a coma. Some of the blame does have to be laid at the feet of the pandemic, which curtailed shooting and meant that the infuriating post-credits sequence in which Michael Keaton's Vulture suddenly appears in a police cell from another universe had to be created with CGI and a voiceover. It's setting up for a sequel. That will thankfully never happen. Perhaps the clearest mark of hubris in the post-Iron Man world is the post-credits sequence angling for a sequel. Honestly, the fact that the pandemic meant that Morbius was a tight 90 minutes rather than 2.5 hours is actually one of the few upsides of a very dark time in human history. So much for Morbius. What about the Asylum? What was their vision for a mockbuster based on this trash? There are plenty of Morbius comics out there, so when the studio were looking at how they might approach this one, they could have tried to do something in the same spirit, crossing over superhero hijinks with the affordances of gothic horror. Instead, they opted, as they so often do, to draw on the public domain, in this case Dracula, who they here dub the original living vampire. It's a solid choice. Dracula has far better name recognition than Morbius anyway, and films about Dracula quite often do well. There's been a ton of Dracula movies out there which riff on Bram Stoker's amazing novel, from 1922's Nosferatu through to Universal horror movies and Francis Ford Coppola's arrestingly sexy 1992 vision of Dracula. It's a tried and tested avenue for low-budget filmmaking and one I find fascinating. A few years back I actually wrote a novel playing with these exact same ideas, which involved not 1 but 10 different possible sequels to Dracula, inserting the count into a variety of situations throughout the 20th century and beyond. It's fair to say I have some affection for Dracula, both the original novel and the endless ways the character can be remixed and rebooted through different artistic lenses. What the Asylum gives us is a curious but fascinating remix of the original Dracula story, in which the various characters are reimagined in order to meld the core narrative with a police procedural. It was directed by Maximilian Elfelt, who has worked extensively for the Asylum in a variety of roles, and written by Michael Verratti, who has written a whole bunch of different horror stuff over the years and clearly loves the genre. It's at this point that I'd usually do an extensive breakdown of the plot, highlighting all the various issues, absurdities, and delightfully Asylum moments in the production, but I'm not going to do that here because the plot and its production style are arguably the least interesting thing about the film. Unlike a lot of Asylum productions, you have a relatively tight cast, and much of the film is less about bizarre plot points as it is about people arguing in rooms. It's basically much more like a proper movie, thanks to a script that is way stronger than the average Asylum film, and a production design that, while hardly lavish, is at least a cut above the bare minimum they usually manage to scrape together. What makes this film interesting is the way it recontextualises the characters of Dracula into a modern police story. The film takes place in an unnamed city which is clearly in Eastern Europe. Amelia Van Helsing is a police detective investigating a series of murders. The victims are all young women, they all have red hair, and they have all been drained of blood in a very spooky way. She works under a gruff captain called Renfield, and is assisted in her investigation by the chief pathologist, Dr. Seward, and an old friend and chemist called Harker, who is drawn to studies of the occult. She's also married to a woman called Mina Murray, a solicitor who is helping a foreign dignitary called Count Dracula buy property in the city. As Amelia Van Helsing investigates the murders, she is unaware that Renfield is secretly under the vampire's spell, and that Dracula has a particular interest in her wife, who strongly resembles, like all his victims, his lost love. Harker becomes more and more convinced that the murders are the result of a vampire, and tries to convince Van Helsing, but it's only when Renfield shows his hand and Dracula abducts Mina that the true scope of his evil becomes clear to her. She and Harker will do whatever it takes to tackle Dracula and rescue the love of her life. And straight away, there's some fun stuff going on here. You can see how the characters have been slightly shuffled around and reimagined while still broadly retaining elements of their roles from the original story. Mina is taking on both her original role of the damsel in distress, but also the role that Harker took in the original novel. Dr. Seward moving from alienist and mad doctor to police pathologist makes sense. Renfield goes from incarcerated madman to mole inside the police force, but he retains his job in the plot of being Dracula's devoted spy and acolyte. Van Helsing appears to have changed the most, going from natural philosopher to hard-nosed detective, but actually her role in the plot of driving the investigation forwards is much the same as Van Helsing's role in the original novel. Harker has arguably changed the most, since he's now the character who pushes the supernatural angle, something that this version of Van Helsing is extremely sceptical of. In fact, you can see quite a lot of Mulder and Scully in Van Helsing and Harker's relationship. They are old friends, but Van Helsing is frustrated by Harker's fascination with the occult, which she sees as a distraction from the reality that there's a serial killer on the loose. Here, though, it's very much the Scully character who's in charge, which reverses the polarity of the relationship from the X-Files series, and I think their relationship is cool. Van Helsing is often frustrated with Harker, but at the same time there's a deep reservoir of mutual respect and affection that comes from being like really old friends. Turning Dracula into a police procedural works pretty well. It's easy to forget that a lot of the original novel involves detective work, with the characters spending more or less the entire middle of the book following leads to track down the Count and his precious boxes of earth. That maps quite well into a loosely modern setting, and it provides a nice simple skeleton for the plot to follow while allowing for a few interesting twists. Also has the advantage of being cheap. Much of Dracula, the original living vampire, involves the characters arguing at crime scenes or in the morgue of the police station, and that's something you can do well even on an Asylum budget. It also provides more than the usual amount of space for character moments, and this is where the film really shines for me. We've seen same-sex relationships in Asylum movies before, but Van Helsing and Mina's relationship is much more convincingly sketched than anything previously seen. Van Helsing muses on how being trusted by the law firm to handle Count Dracula's affairs has been a really big deal for Mina, who's struggled with her confidence since she was a child, thanks to the isolating effects of growing up gay. For her part, Mina sees the toll that police work takes on her wife and wants to be, fully supportive. Their relationship is much more than just two women who kiss. They have insights into each other's inner life, and that creates a bond that's more convincing than many relationships I've seen in low-budget horror. It's certainly more convincing than the relationship in Morbius, where Morbius just does not care at all about his love interest's inner life. I think this is probably because Michael Verratti is himself a queer man, and I think this is what informs the way he writes Dracula. Here, Dracula is presented as a truly chilling avatar of both toxic masculinity and the aristocracy. In the novel, Dracula's obsession with Mina is filtered through Stoker's own sexual neuroses into a form of sexual contamination in which Mina is othered by being the victim of a sexual assault. Stoker had some serious issues around sex, and Dracula's predatory sexuality is contrasted with a fundamentally platonic ideal of romantic love that sees its ultimate expression in three men being in love with poor doomed Lucy Westenra, but none of them being able to consummate that love physically. Dracula's crime is as much that he taints that love by his physical intimacy with the women he murders as it is about the direct damage he deals to Lucy. And it's similar with Mina, although she will ultimately survive and be forgiven for her transgressions of being sexually assaulted by a manipulative vampire. Stoker was a messed up dude when it came to sex. Francis Ford Coppola explored the transgressive elements in a different way by suggesting that Mina is attracted to Dracula because Dracula represents a kind of freedom from the repressive structures of Victorian sexuality, and hinting that she may indeed somehow be the reincarnation of his beloved. Also, Dracula is Gary Oldman in a lovely set of togs. It might have been more convincing if her Jonathan Harker hadn't been handsome, lovely Keanu Reeves, but it still basically works. Sex is still a problem in Coppola's version of Dracula, and Mina still transgresses, but at least it locates the problem more within a social context and suggests some active and relatable agency on the part of Mina in the story, and a genuine, albeit twisted, form of love on the part of the Count. In Dracula, the original living vampire, the blame is placed squarely where it belongs, on Dracula. He's a piece of shit who is searching for the reincarnation of his lost love. He's going to find his perfect redhead to be his wife for all eternity, and he's straight up murdering the ones who don't meet up to his standards. When he finds Mina, there's nothing to suggest she's actually the reincarnation of his beloved, just that she looks an awful lot like her. The fact that she's a lesbian is completely irrelevant so far as Dracula is concerned. She looks the part, and that is all he cares about. During the finale, Mina says that she'll go with him willingly if he's prepared to leave Van Helsing alive, and Dracula explicitly states that he doesn't give a toss whether she's willing or not. She gets no say in the matter, and it makes for a true vampiric villain. Early on, when Harker is excitedly banging on about there being saliva in the neck wounds of the victims and this indicating a vampire, Van Helsing, still in skeptic mode, shuts him down and tells him she doesn't care about this stuff. She just wants to catch a mass murderer who targets women. Even though Harker turns out to be right, so is Van Helsing. That is all this version of Dracula ultimately is, a mass murderer who targets women with red hair. He sees women as objects to be either possessed or used and discarded. He comes across as almost like an incel. He sees sex as being something men are entitled to from women. But there's another layer as well, which is his position as an aristocrat. He doesn't just want to possess women from a lack of understanding of women as independent beings with their own inner lives separate from his own. He's also rich and powerful and therefore entitled to possess women as props for his vanity by virtue of his birth. It would be very easy to imagine this version of Dracula going into politics and hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein. He's very much that kind of ghoul. As well as having interesting characters, actual themes, and a plot that flows significantly better than most Asylum movies, this also looks better than average. I think that's partly down to the relative paucity of special effects work. There's a few simple practical effects for some of the vampire stuff, There's a couple of equally simple bits of action, and there's a tiny amount of trademark Asylum CGI, mostly confined to a swarm of bats, which look as rubbish as you'd expect, but they only appear briefly, they're not critical to any of the action, so it's fine. The sets look a bit better than usual as well, possibly due to the lower FX budget. Most of the rooms look like places rather than empty office cubicles. And the set and costume design is also quite interesting. The film seems to take place in an entirely imaginary city at an imaginary time period. It's modern in the sense that people seem to have modern clothes, but everyone is quite formally dressed. There's not a t-shirt or hoodie to be seen. It was filmed in Belgrade, and there's lots of lovely shots of the looming architecture of some of the city's most baroque bits of 19th century architecture, which serves to anchor it to a consistent sense of place in a way that very few Asylum films manage. This being an Asylum film, there's still an awful lot of the cast teleporting from one interior to the next, but there are some external shots that help give it the vague impression that they're inhabiting an actual city, which is nice. And I think the cast are pretty good. It's a collection of very cheap British thesps and one Canadian with a proven track record. Dr. Seward is played by the resident old hand, in this case Michael Ironside, who is one of the few character actors to rival Eric Roberts for sheer number of credits. He was in films like Total Recall, Starship Troopers and Top Gun, but honestly, if there's a camera rolling, he will step in front of it and deliver a decent performance. He's hardly stretching himself here as the bluff old doctor, but he's still doing a good job. The other experienced actor in the production is Stuart Packer as Renfield, who brings a nice mix of authority and creepy menace to the part of the police officer secretly working for Dracula. The rest of the tight cast is much younger and less well known. India Davis as Mina has been in some fairly high profile things, notably Bridgerton, but she's still very much at the start of her career, and she delivers a very sweet performance as the emotional core of the film. Ryan Woodcock is solid as Harker. It's a committed performance, and he plays very well with Christine Prouty as Van Helsing. They've got a natural chemistry together, which allows them both to express their character without trying to steal the limelight from the other. Christine Prouty is the least experienced of the main actors, and I'd be lying if I said that inexperience doesn't show. She's not a great actor, but she's giving it her all, and that counts for a lot with me. Her line delivery can be a bit flat, but she's rather better physically. She's got a lovely, commanding body language, and it's nice to see a woman unapologetically taking up space in the frame, and the hard-bitten detective character does suit her relatively muted performance. And it's amazing how much more forgiving I can be of performers when I like both the character and the script, and that very much extends to Jake Herbert as Dracula. This is his only acting credit, although he did appear as a model in 2 episodes of Glow Up, the extremely queer makeup artist competition, which is one of my guilty pleasures. I always say that I don't have many stereotypical queer tastes, but every once in a while something really gay does slip through the barriers of slasher movies, death metal and professional wrestling. Jake Herbert is very handsome, and he's doing his absolute best, but the film wisely keeps him as a peripheral character in the action. And even this, the weakest performance, isn't so bad as to be distracting. While this is comfortably the best Asylum movie I've ever seen, it's not without its issues. Most of them are familiar to listeners: the difficulty staging the action scenes, the need to shoot pretty much everything at close range, the constant awareness that this is all very cheap. That's standard, but it's also really quite dark for some reason. There were a few moments where I was struggling to parse the action due to the low level of the lighting. I mean, it takes place mostly at night, and some of the time that makes the film moody in the same way as films like Seven and Dark City are moody, but sometimes it just means I can't quite follow what's going on. It's not enough to sink the film for me, but I think someone less charitably disposed towards extremely low-budget filmmaking might well find it challenging. I really wish they'd managed to light it better at key moments. It's not something that Asylum productions usually struggle with either, and it makes it vibe as a semi-amateur production at times, which is a shame given how comparatively slick some of the other elements of the film are. Overall though, Dracula, the original living vampire, shows what you can do with almost nothing if you've got a decent script, a few decent locations, and actors willing to give it their all. It's that rarest of beasts, an Asylum movie actually capable of delivering a film that looks like the film it's trying to be. unlike something like King of the Lost World or Titanic 2, which absolutely cannot be the film they are claiming on the poster to be. I genuinely enjoyed watching it, and only about 20% of that enjoyment was ironic. It's a much more interesting film than Morbius, not least because it has a fundamental understanding of how morality actually works and how human beings ought to relate to each other. It also, and I can't stress this enough, doesn't have Jared Leto in it. It's an entirely Jared Leto-free experience, and that counts for a lot. That is all for this episode. Next episode, we are going to be sticking with the horror theme and heading back to the 19th century for the historical zombie movie Abraham Lincoln vs. Zombies. I imagine that will be a lovely old time. If you want to get in touch with me in the meantime, you can do so via email at hjdoomretrofun, all one word, at gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at hjdoom. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you soon.